The morning sun peeked through the tall buildings of New York City as Senator John Kennedy's black car pulled up to the ABC studios. He checked his watch. It was 7:30 a.m., and he had not planned to be here today. Kennedy was in town for his book tour, promoting American values, a return to greatness, which had been selling well among his supporters. His phone had rung just after dinner the night before. The caller was Nancy Miller, executive producer of The View, a daytime talk show. Known for its all-female panel and often heated political discussions? "Senator Kennedy," Nancy had said, her voice slightly desperate. "We had a last-minute cancellation for tomorrow's show. Our guest was a movie star promoting his new film, but he's down with the flu. We'd love to have you on instead to discuss your book." Kennedy had hesitated. The View was not friendly territory for conservative politicians. The show's hosts were known for their liberal views, and Republican guests often left feeling ambushed. "I appreciate the invitation, Nancy," he'd replied carefully. "But your show isn't exactly known for fair treatment of folks like me, I promise." "You'll get fair time to promote your book," Nancy had assured him. "And yes, there will be policy questions, but nothing you haven't handled before. Think of the exposure we reach millions of viewers daily." Kennedy knew she was right about the exposure. His book was selling well, but an appearance on a major daytime show could push it even higher on the bestseller lists. After consulting with his publicist, Greg Peters, he had agreed. Now, as he stepped out of the car, Kennedy felt a mix of caution and determination. Greg walked beside him, carrying a copy of the senator's book and a folder of talking points. "Remember," Greg said quietly, "stay focused on the book. If they push on immigration, give your standard response and pivot back to American values. Don't get baited." Kennedy nodded. At 63, he was no newcomer to hostile media. His southern drawl and folksy manner often led opponents to underestimate his sharp legal mind and quick wit. Before entering politics, he had been a successful attorney and law professor. Inside the studio building, a young woman with a clipboard met them in the lobby. "Senator Kennedy, welcome to The View. I'm Amber, one of the production assistants. If you'll follow me, we'll get you to makeup and then to the green room." As they walked through the building's corridors, Kennedy could feel the eyes of staff members on him. Some looked curious, others seemed surprised, and a few appeared openly hostile. He kept his politician's smile firmly in place. In the makeup room, a woman named Debbie applied powder to his face while chatting pleasantly about the weather. Kennedy relaxed slightly. In his experience, makeup artists and sound technicians were often the most normal people in television. Not too much. "Now," he joked as she worked. "I don't want to look like I'm trying to hide anything," Debbie laughed. "Don't worry, Senator. We go natural for the male guests." The hosts, on the other hand, Ch. She raised her eyebrows meaningfully. After makeup, Kennedy was led to the green room, where he could watch the show's opening on a monitor. The four hosts, Diane Richards, Paula Thompson, Maria Sanchez, and Olivia Wright, walked onto the stage to enthusiastic applause from the studio audience. Diane, the show's longest-serving host, spoke first. "We have an exciting show for you today. Coming up, Senator John Kennedy will be joining us to discuss his new book and, of course, some of his recent controversial statements on immigration." Kennedy frowned. Nancy had mentioned his book first, not his politics. Already the framing seemed designed to put him on defense. In the green room, Greg noticed his expression. "Stay cool. They're just setting up drama for their audience. Stick to the plan." Meanwhile, during a commercial break, the hosts gathered quickly at their table to discuss their approach. "I'll start with the book questions," Diane said, flipping through her note cards. "It's about 10 minutes on that, then Maria. You transitioned to immigration policy." Maria nodded. "I've got the quotes from his Senate speech last week. Pretty inflammatory stuff." Paula adjusted her glasses. "I've researched the actual statistics to counter his claims. The studies show immigrants commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens." Olivia, the youngest host, looked nervous. "He's known for talking over people. How do we handle that?" "We stay firm," Diane replied. This is our show. If he gets out of hand, I'll cut to commercial. Back in the green room, Kennedy was reviewing his own notes when Nancy Miller entered. 5 minutes, Senator, she said cheerfully. Any questions before you go on? Kennedy closed his folder. Just to confirm, Nancy, we're focusing on the book first, correct? Absolutely. She nodded. Though, as I mentioned, the hosts will have some policy questions, too. It's a hot topic, and our viewers expect us to address current events. Kennedy smiled thinly. Of course they do. Production assistant appeared at the door. We're back from commercial in 30 seconds. Senator, if you'll follow me, please. As Kennedy walked toward the stage, he could hear the hosts introducing him. Please welcome Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, Diane announced. The audience applause was polite, but not enthusiastic, as Kennedy walked onto the set. He noticed several people in the front rows wearing blue immigrants' welcome buttons. He shook hands with each host, his politician's smile never wavering. Thank you, ladies, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in New York. Kennedy settled into the guest chair, positioning his book on the small table beside him so the cover faced the camera. It was a move his publicist had taught him years ago. Senator Kennedy, Diane began, your new book is called American Values, A Return to Greatness. What exactly do you mean by a return to greatness? Many would argue America is already great. Kennedy leaned forward slightly. Well, Diane, America is indeed the greatest nation on earth. No argument there. But we've strayed from some of the core principles that made us great: hard work, personal responsibility, rule of law, and respect for our Constitution. Paula jumped in before he could continue. Some might say those are coded words for a return to less inclusive times. Kennedy felt his jaw tighten, but kept his smile in place. Oh, I'd have to disagree with that interpretation, Paula. The values I'm talking about aren't exclusive to any race, gender, or background. They're universal principles that benefit everyone. For the next few minutes, Kennedy managed to steer the conversation back to specific chapters in his book, using rehearsed talking points and the occasional folksy analogy that drew light laughter from parts of the audience, but he could sense the hosts growing impatient, exchanging quick glances with each other. They were waiting for their moment to change direction. That moment came when Maria Sanchez leaned forward. Senator, in your book you talk about respecting the rule of law. Last week in a Senate hearing you made some statements about immigration that many found troubling. You called the situation at the border an invasion and suggested that most illegal immigrants are criminals. Would you care to explain those comments to our viewers? Kennedy felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. This was the ambush he had expected, but it had come sooner than anticipated. He glanced at the teleprompter behind the camera, which now displayed the words immigration segment. He realized then that this had been the plan all along. The book was just a pretense to get him on the show. What they really wanted was a confrontation about immigration that would generate clips for social media and boost their ratings. Kennedy made a quick decision. If they wanted a discussion about immigration, he would give them one they wouldn't forget. He placed his hands on his knees, leaned forward, and prepared to speak his mind in a way that would shock the hosts, the audience, and eventually the entire country. Kennedy took a slow sip of water from the mug on the small table beside him. The studio lights felt hot on his face. He could see his publicist, Greg, standing off camera, arms crossed, a worried expression on his face. Eyes. It meant the senator was about to go off script. Well, Maria, Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl more pronounced than usual. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's talk about what's really happening at our southern border. Anne smiled tightly. This was exactly what they had hoped for. Controversy that would drive viewership. Please do, Senator. Kennedy leaned forward in his chair. What we have at our border isn't just a policy disagreement. It's a full-blown crisis that affects real Americans in real ways that folks in Manhattan high-rises don't see firsthand. Eyebrows shot up. Are you suggesting we don't understand the issue because we live in New York? What I'm suggesting, Kennedy continued, his voice calm but firm, is that there's often a disconnect between how these issues are discussed in media, centers like New York, and how they're experienced in places like Louisiana, Texas, and Arizona. Olivia jumped in. But Senator, recent studies show that immigrants, including undocumented ones, commit fewer crimes than native-born citizens. Aren't your comments just feeding into fear rather than facts? The audience murmured in agreement. Kennedy noticed a woman in the front row, nodding vigorously. Here's the thing about those studies, Kennedy replied, placing his book on the table. They don't distinguish between legal immigrants who are among our hardest working, most law-abiding citizens and those who enter illegally. When we conflate the two groups, we do a disservice to those who followed the rules. Maria tried to interrupt, but Kennedy held up his hand. If I could finish my point, please? The studio grew quiet. Kennedy rarely raised his voice, but his tone made it clear he would not be talked over. Every nation has both the right and responsibility to control who crosses its borders. That's not controversial anywhere else in the world. Only here do we pretend it's somehow wrong to expect people to enter legally? Diane shifted in her seat. Senator, no one is saying we shouldn't have borders. The disagreement is about how. We treat people who are already here, many of whom are fleeing terrible conditions. Kennedy nodded. And I have tremendous sympathy for folks in difficult situations. But compassion doesn't mean we abandon the rule of law. Doesn't mean we ignore the impacts on American communities. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I have here statistics from my state showing the strain on local resources, schools, hospitals, law enforcement. These are real concerns from real people, not talking points. Paula looked skeptical. May I see those statistics? Kennedy handed her the paper. By all means. And while you're looking at those numbers, let me tell you about a town in my state, where the local hospital nearly closed because of unpaid emergency room bills from undocumented patients. As Paula scanned the document, her expression changed from skepticism to concern. The numbers were higher than she expected. These are troubling figures, she admitted. Couldn't this be addressed with better funding rather than harsher border policies? Kennedy saw his opening. That's a fair question, Paula. But why should American taxpayers foot an ever-increasing bill for services to people who entered our country illegally? Especially when we have American citizens, including veterans, children, and elderly folks who need those same resources. The audience was divided now. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked uncomfortable or angry. Psh, what about the children brought here when they were too young to have any say in the matter? Olivia asked. Do you support deporting them to countries they've never known? Kennedy's expression softened slightly. It's a complex issue that requires nuance, not sound bites. Those young people are in a difficult position through no fault of their own. I think most Americans want a compassionate solution for them, provided it doesn't encourage more illegal crossings in the future. Maria looked surprised by his measured response. She had expected more hardline rhetoric based on his previous statements. So you do support some path to legal status for dreamers? She asked. I support solutions that are fair, compassionate, and respect our laws, Kennedy replied carefully. What I don't support is using these young people as political pawns, which both parties have done for too long. Diane glanced at her notes, then at the clock. The segment was running long, but the ratings team in her earpiece was telling her to keep going. This was compelling television. Senator, let's talk about your use of the word invasion when describing border crossings, Diane said. Many find that language dehumanizing and inflammatory. Would you use different words if you could do it over? Kennedy didn't hesitate. I chose that word deliberately. Diane, when thousands of people cross our border every day without permission, what would you call it? A humanitarian crisis? Olivia suggested. A symptom of failed foreign policy, added Maria. Kennedy shook his head. Those descriptions ignore the deliberate choice people make to violate our laws. Look, I understand why they come. If I lived in those conditions, I might try to come here too. But that doesn't change the fact that a nation without control of its borders isn't really a sovereign nation at all. The tension in the studio was building. A man in the audience stood up and shouted, "Thank you, Senator." Before security quickly escorted him back to his seat, Paula shifted the conversation. Let's talk about the wall that was promised. Billions spent, and experts say it's been largely ineffective. Wasn't that money wasted? Kennedy smiled. Walls work where they're built properly and maintained. Just ask the homeowners in your Manhattan high-rises who have dormant and security systems. Physical barriers are just one part of border security, but they're an important part. Olivia looked frustrated. That's an oversimplification of a complex issue. Sometimes simple truths get lost in complex discussions, Kennedy replied. Here's another simple truth. Every country in the world expects people to enter legally. Try sneaking into Canada, Mexico, or any European country and see how that works out for you. The audience laughed, breaking some of the tension. Kennedy continued, his voice growing more passionate. This isn't about keeping people out because they're different. America welcomes more legal immigrants than any nation on earth. We're the most generous country in history. But generosity without limits isn't sustainable. Maria leaned forward. Senator, what about asylum seekers who are following legal processes by presenting themselves at the border? A valid question, Kennedy acknowledged. Our asylum system needs reform. It was designed for individual cases of persecution, not as a backdoor immigration program for everyone living in difficult conditions. Most asylum claims are eventually rejected, but by then, many people have disappeared into the country. As the conversation continued, Kennedy noticed Diane glancing off camera. Producer was signaling for a commercial break. They had been discussing immigration for almost 15 minutes without interruption. We'll continue this discussion after the break, Diane announced. We're talking with Senator John Kennedy about his new book and his views on immigration. As the cameras cut away, Kennedy removed his microphone to take another sip of water. He could see Greg looking both concerned and impressed. The conversation had been contentious, but substantive. Kennedy had made his points without losing his temper or saying anything that would create negative headlines. But as the makeup artist rushed in to powder his forehead during the break, he overheard Diane whispering to the other hosts, "Hit him harder on the racism angle when we come back," she said quietly. "We need him to lose his cool." That's what people tune in for. Kennedy's jaw tightened, so that was their game. They didn't want a real discussion. They wanted a viral moment at his expense. Replaced his microphone, a new determination in his eyes. If they wanted fireworks, he would give them an explosion they wouldn't forget. The commercial break ended, and the red light on the camera flashed on. Kennedy sat straighter in his chair. He had made a decision during the break. He would no longer play defense. The gloves were coming off. "Welcome back to The View," Diane said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're continuing our conversation with Senator John Kennedy about immigration issues." Maria jumped in immediately. "Senator, before the break you were explaining your position on border security. Many critics say the rhetoric you and others use has racial undertones. How do you respond to accusations that your stance is rooted in prejudice against Latino immigrants?" Kennedy looked directly at Maria. Her question was exactly what he had overheard them planning. The trap was set, but he wouldn't walk into it. Maria, Kennedy said calmly. "And it shows exactly what's wrong with how we discuss important issues in this country." "What do you mean?" Paula asked. "I mean that when someone disagrees with the current administration's border policies, they're immediately labeled as racist. That's not honest debate. That's character assassination designed to shut down conversation." Olivia interjected, "But when you use words like invasion," Kennedy turned to her. "Let me ask you something, Olivia. If 10,000 Russians or Chinese crossed our northern border illegally every day, would you call that an invasion?" Olivia paused, caught off guard by the question. "That's a hypothetical that it's not hypothetical. It's a fair comparison," Kennedy pressed. "The word invasion describes a large number of people entering without permission. It has nothing to do with race or nationality." Diane tried to regain control. "Let's focus on solutions rather than semantics." "I agree," Kennedy nodded. "But we can't find solutions when one side is constantly accused of bigotry for simply wanting to enforce existing laws." He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "Let me share some facts that your viewers might not hear often. Last year alone, Border Patrol encountered over 2 million people crossing illegally. That's more than the population of 15 states. They've seized enough fentanyl to kill every American several times over. Human trafficking arrests doubled. These aren't Republican talking points. They're from the current administration's own reports. Paula looked skeptical. Those numbers need context. Most people crossing the border are families seeking better lives, not criminals. Some are. Absolutely, Kennedy agreed. And I sympathize with their desire for a better life. But compassion doesn't mean open borders. It certainly doesn't mean ignoring the very real criminal elements that exploit this crisis. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice growing more intense. Let me tell you about a family in my state. Martinez's legal immigrants, who spent 10 years going through the proper channels to come here from Guatemala. Mr. Martinez works 2 jobs. Mrs. Martinez runs a small bakery. Their daughter is studying to become a doctor. He paused to let that sink in. They followed the rules. They respect this country enough to come here legally, and they're frustrated watching others cut in line with no consequences. Are the Martinezes racist for feeling that way? The studio grew quiet. Kennedy had effectively turned the accusation of racism back on his accusers. Diane decided to shift tactics. Senator, what about the economic benefits immigrants bring? Studies show they contribute billions to our economy. Legal immigrants absolutely do, Kennedy agreed. I'm all for legal immigration. America needs hardworking people who want to be Americans, not just live in America. But uncontrolled illegal immigration is different. It drives down wages for working-class Americans, strains public services, and creates unfair competition. For those who follow the rules, Maria shook her head. But these people are doing jobs Americans won't do. Kennedy's eyes flashed. That talking point needs to be retired permanently. What you're really saying is these people will work for wages so low that Americans can't afford to take those jobs. Instead of addressing why those wages are unlivable, we import vulnerable people who can be exploited. How is that moral or compassionate? The audience stirred. Kennedy was making points that resonated even with some who had come in disagreeing. With him, Olivia tried another approach. What about the children in detention facilities? Surely you can't defend separating families. No one wants to see children in difficult situations, Kennedy replied. But let me ask you this. If an American parent commits a crime with their child present, do they get to avoid arrest because they have a child with them? Of course not. The situation is heartbreaking, but the responsibility lies with parents who knowingly put their children in that position. Paula's face reddened. That's an incredibly callous view. These parents are desperate. Kennedy didn't back down. It's not callous to expect people to follow laws. It's not callous to point out that actions have consequences. What's truly callous is encouraging people to make a dangerous journey where 1/3 of women are sexually assaulted, where children are abandoned in the desert, where cartels profit from human suffering. He turned to face the audience directly. The media won't show you the bodies found in the desert. It won't show you the children used as pawns by traffickers. They won't show you the actual communities overwhelmed by this crisis. Instead, they call people like me racist for wanting to stop this humanitarian disaster. Diane tried to interrupt, but Kennedy continued, his voice rising with emotion. Me be perfectly clear. This isn't about race or ethnicity. This is about respect for law. This is about national sovereignty. This is about protecting both American citizens and those who want to immigrate legally. He pointed at each host in turn. The 4 of you sit here in your Manhattan studio, far removed from the realities at the border, and lecture Americans about compassion. But real compassion means stopping the chaos that leads to suffering. Real compassion means creating a system that works for everyone. The audience was completely silent now, captivated by Kennedy's passionate speech. Even some staff members had stopped what they were doing to listen. Senator Diane said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "You're making sweeping generalizations about our views. Am I wrong?" Kennedy challenged. Has any one of you ever called for stricter enforcement of immigration laws? Has any one of you acknowledged the legitimate concerns of border communities? Has any one of you criticized the current administration's handling of this crisis? None of the hosts responded immediately. Kennedy had backed them into a corner. Finally, Paula spoke. Yeah, we try to present balanced viewpoints on this show. Kennedy laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. Balance would mean acknowledging that wanting secure borders doesn't make someone racist, Or balance would mean admitting that illegal immigration has real costs. Balance would mean treating this as a policy discussion, not a moral crusade where one side claims the high ground and demonizes the other. Maria attempted to change the subject. Let's get back to your book, Senator. No, Kennedy said firmly. Let's not pretend this conversation didn't happen. Your viewers deserve honesty. They deserve to hear perspectives that challenge their assumptions, just as my constituents need to hear perspectives that challenge theirs. Nancy Miller, the executive producer, was frantically signaling from off-camera. This wasn't the controlled controversy she had hoped for. Kennedy had taken over the narrative completely. Diane glanced at her teleprompter, now displaying go to break, but decided against it. Cutting away now would only make Kennedy's accusations about silencing different viewpoints seem more valid. We have about 2 minutes left in this segment, she said. Senator, what final message would you like to leave with our viewers? Kennedy looked directly into the camera. To every American watching, I want you to know it's okay to want secure borders. It's okay to expect people to follow our laws. It's okay to be concerned about the impacts on your community. You're not a bad person for having these concerns, despite what some might imply. The studio was completely silent as Kennedy finished speaking. The red light on the camera blinked off, signaling another commercial break in the control room. Producers stared at their monitors in shock. Social media was already exploding. The segment was trending nationally, with viewers from across the political spectrum sharing clips and commenting. Nancy turned to her assistant, her expression a mix of concern and excitement. Get security ready for when he leaves the stage. Prepare the hosts for damage control in the next segment. Kennedy sat calmly in his chair as makeup artists rushed to touch up the hosts. He knew he had just created the kind of television moment that would be replayed for weeks. The question was whether he would be portrayed as a villain or a truth-teller. Either way, he had said exactly what he came to say. During the commercial break, the studio buzzed with tense activity. Makeup artists dabbed at the hosts' foreheads, while producers huddled in small groups, speaking urgently into their headsets. Kennedy sat calmly in his chair, declining the offer of more water or makeup touch dash-ups. Nancy Miller marched onto the set, her face set in a tight smile. She bent down and whispered something in Diane's ear. Diane nodded, her expression grim. Senator, Nancy said, turning to Kennedy, we'll be moving to a different segment after the break. Thank you for your time today. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. I still have 10 minutes scheduled according to the rundown I was given this morning. Nancy's smile never wavered. Plans change. We need to move on to other topics our viewers are expecting. Kennedy understood what was happening. They were cutting his segment short because he had taken control of the narrative. He slowly removed his microphone and handed it to a nearby technician. Understand completely, he said, his Louisiana drawl more pronounced. Can't have too much of that pesky different perspective, can we? Nancy's smile faltered. Before she could respond, Kennedy stood up and addressed the four hosts. Directly, ladies, I appreciate the invitation to your show. I hope your viewers found our discussion enlightening, even if it wasn't what you expected. Paula nodded stiffly while the others avoided eye contact. Kennedy gathered his book and notes, preparing to leave the stage. Then something unexpected happened. A man in the audience stood up. Senator Kennedy, he called out loudly, thank you for speaking the truth. Several security guards moved toward the man, but before they reached him, a woman on the opposite side of the studio also stood. My son was killed by a drunk driver who had been deported 3 times, she said, her voice breaking. Why doesn't anyone talk about victims like my boy? The studio erupted. Some audience members applauded, while others shouted in disagreement. The floor director frantically signaled for security to remove the disruptive audience members. Kennedy paused, watching the scene unfold. He hadn't planned this, but he recognized a pivotal moment when he saw one. As a security guard approached the grieving mother, Kennedy made a split-second decision. He put his microphone back on. Ma'am, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos, I'm very sorry about your son. What was his name? The cameras, which had been focused on the audience disturbance, swung back to Kennedy. The director in the control room shouted into his headset, Cut to commercial! Cut now! What? But the camera operator hesitated, captivated by the unfolding drama. By the time another technician took over, Kennedy was walking across the stage toward the woman. His name was Bobby, the woman said, tears streaming down her face. He was 22. The man who killed him had been caught at the border twice before. Kennedy nodded solemnly. Bobby's death matters. It shouldn't be dismissed as just an unfortunate incident or a talking point. Nancy Miller was now frantically waving her arms, trying to get Kennedy's attention, but he deliberately ignored her. This is exactly what I was talking about, Kennedy continued, projecting his voice to ensure it was captured by his still active microphone. Real people affected by policy failures, and their stories are ignored because they don't fit particular narrative. Diane finally stood up from the table. We're going to take a break now. Senator Kennedy, please. Please, what? Kennedy turned to face her, his patience visibly evaporating. Please stop talking about realities that make you uncomfortable. Please stick to approved talking points. Please pretend that policies don't have consequences. The control room finally managed to cut to commercial, but Kennedy's microphone was still live for the studio audience. He was no longer performing for television cameras, but speaking directly to the people in front of him. Every one of you in this room knows someone affected by this crisis, Kennedy said, his voice rising with genuine emotion. Whether it's lower wages, overcrowded schools, stretched healthcare systems, or, God forbid, crimes that shouldn't have happened. But we're told we can't talk about these things without being labeled as hateful. Security guards now surrounded Kennedy, not touching him but making their presence known. Nancy Miller approached him directly. Senator, I need to ask you to leave. The stage now, she said firmly. Kennedy nodded. I'll go. But I want to say one thing to Bobby's mother first. Nancy hesitated, then stepped aside. Kennedy walked to the edge of the stage where the woman stood crying. Ma'am, I'm truly sorry for your loss, he said quietly. My office will contact you after the show. Bobby's story deserves to be told, and I promise you it will be. The woman nodded gratefully as Kennedy turned to leave the stage. The audience was divided, some standing and applauding, others sitting with arms crossed and expressions of disgust. As Kennedy walked backstage, his publicist Greg rushed to his side, his face a mix of panic and awe. What just happened out there? Greg whispered urgently. That wasn't the plan. Kennedy handed him his microphone. Plans change, remember? In the green room, Kennedy could see monitors showing the hosts back on air, trying to regain control of the show. Diane was speaking directly to the camera, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly. We want to apologize for that unexpected interruption, she was saying. Here at The View, we believe in respectful dialogue about difficult issues. What we just witnessed was not that. Kennedy smiled grimly as he gathered his belongings. He knew exactly what would happen next. The show would try to paint him as out of control, maybe even dangerous. They would characterize his words as an angry rant rather than passionate advocacy. They would bring on experts to contextualize his statements and point out perceived inaccuracies. But none of that mattered now. In the age of social media, the unedited clips would be circulating within minutes. Millions would see what actually happened, not just the sanitized version The View presented. Outside the dressing room, Bobby's mother waited, escorted by a sympathetic production assistant. Kennedy invited her inside and closed the door. For the next 10 minutes, he listened as she shared stories about her son, his love of baseball, his plans to become a teacher, his volunteer work with local kids. When she finished, Kennedy took her hand. Mrs. Johnson, would you be willing to share Bobby's story more widely, not as a political statement, but as a reminder that behind statistics are real people and real losses? She nodded through her tears. That's all I've wanted, for someone to acknowledge that his life mattered. Meanwhile, in the studio, the show continued with forced normalcy. But backstage was chaos. Network executives were on the phone demanding explanations. Social media teams were scrambling to respond to the explosion of comments and shares. Security was escorting audience members who continued to be disruptive. Nancy Miller stood in the control room, watching multiple screens. One showed the current segment with the hosts discussing a celebrity cookbook. Another displayed social media metrics that were climbing by the second. A third showed news networks already picking up the story. "This is either the best or worst." Day in the show's history, she muttered to her assistant. "I'm not sure which yet." Outside the studio, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread quickly about what happened inside. Some held hastily made signs supporting Kennedy, while others chanted. In opposition, news vans were already setting up for live reports in his dressing room. Kennedy checked his phone, which was overflowing with messages from colleagues, constituents, and media outlets. His press secretary had sent a simple text, "Standing by. For your statement, this is going nuclear." Kennedy looked in the mirror and straightened his tie. The next few hours would be critical. How he handled the aftermath would determine whether this incident became a defining moment in his career, or just another fleeting controversy in the non-stop news cycle. One thing was certain he had walked into: the View as a senator promoting a book. He would walk out as the center of a national conversation about immigration, media bias, and the limits of acceptable discourse in America. By the time Kennedy left the ABC studios, the scene outside had transformed into something resembling a political rally. Several hundred people had gathered on the sidewalk, having seen clips of the confrontation on social media. Police officers formed a line separating supporters from protesters. Both sides, waving hastily, made signs and chanting competing slogans. Kennedy's security detail, consisting of 2 men from his office, plus additional guards provided by the network, surrounded him as he emerged from a side exit. Despite their urging to head straight for the waiting car, Kennedy paused. He spotted a cluster of reporters with microphones and cameras. Senator Kennedy," they called out. "Will you make a statement about what happened inside?" "Greg?" His publicist grabbed Kennedy's arm. "Not here. Not now. Let's get some distance and formulate a proper response." Kennedy shook his head. "No, they'll control the story if I don't speak now." He approached the reporters, and the shouting immediately quieted as microphones thrust toward him. Camera lights clicked on, bathing his face in harsh brightness. "Senator, do you regret your comments on The View today?" A young female reporter asked. Kennedy looked directly into the cameras. "I don't regret speaking the truth. What I regret is that we've created a media environment where honest discussions about difficult issues are nearly impossible. Your critics are already saying." "Your comments were racist and inflammatory," another reporter said. "How do you respond?" "I'm not surprised," Kennedy replied, his voice steady. "When you can't win an argument on facts, you attack the character of your opponent. Not once did I mention race. I talked about respecting our laws and the consequences of failing to enforce them." He pointed toward the studio building behind him. "What happened in there today wasn't about me losing my temper. It was about a television show that invited a guest with different views and then tried to shut him down when he wouldn't follow their script." As he spoke, more people gathered around, including some audience members who had been inside during the taping. One of them called out, "He's right." They cut his mic when that poor mother started talking. Kennedy acknowledged the comment with a nod. "Mrs. Johnson lost her son Bobby to a preventable tragedy. Her story deserves to be heard, not silenced because it's inconvenient to a particular narrative." A reporter from CNN pushed forward. "Do you worry that your comments might encourage violence against immigrants?" Kennedy's eyes flashed with controlled anger. "That question perfectly illustrates the problem. I spent nearly an hour explicitly distinguishing between legal immigrants who follow the rules and those who enter illegally. I repeatedly praise legal immigrants as among our hardest working, most valuable citizens, yet you deliberately ignore those distinctions to imply I'm encouraging violence." The reporter started to respond, but Kennedy continued. "This kind of dishonest framing is exactly why millions of Americans no longer trust mainstream media. You're not interested in what I actually said. You're interested in creating a controversy to drive clicks and views." Behind the reporters, the crowd had grown larger. Kennedy's supporters cheered his response while others booed and shouted counterarguments. Police officers moved in to maintain order as the energy of the crowd intensified. Kennedy's security team became visibly nervous. "Senator, we need to leave now," one of them said firmly. Kennedy nodded, but before turning to go, he made one final Statement to the press. I invite every American to watch the unedited footage of today's interview. Don't rely on selective clips or secondhand accounts. Listen to what I actually said, not what others claim I said, and then make up your own mind. As Kennedy was escorted to his waiting car, his phone buzzed with a call from the Senate Majority Leader. John, the leader said when Kennedy answered. What the hell happened? I'm looking at Twitter, and it's exploding. I spoke honestly about immigration, Kennedy replied, as his car pulled away from the curb, and the host didn't like it. Ow. The White House is already responding. They're calling your comments dangerous rhetoric that undermines American values. Kennedy laughed without humor. Of course they are. Heaven forbid we have an honest conversation about the consequences of their policies. This is going to be a firestorm, the leader warned. Are you prepared for that? Kennedy looked out the window at the New York streets passing by. I've been in politics long enough to know how this works. For the next few days, I'll be either a villain or a hero, depending on who's telling the story. But by next week, there will be a new controversy for everyone to obsess over. Don't be so sure, the leader replied. This one has legs. The clips are everywhere. Every show will be talking about it tonight. After ending the call, Kennedy opened his social media apps. The leader wasn't exaggerating. His name was trending nationwide. Video clips of the confrontation had millions of views already. News websites had breaking headlines about the explosive exchange and chaotic scene at The View. His press secretary had sent him links to several articles already published online. The framing was exactly as he expected. Liberal outlets described him as losing control and making inflammatory anti-immigrant statements. Conservative sites praised him for standing up to media bias and speaking hard truths. Almost none of them included his full remarks or proper context. By the time Kennedy reached his hotel, reporters were already waiting in the lobby. His security team escorted him through a service entrance to avoid them. In his suite, he found his staff gathered around laptops and phones, monitoring the growing media storm. Sir, his chief of staff said, we've had over 2,000 calls to the office in the last hour. The phone lines are jammed. Supportive or critical? Kennedy asked. About 4-1 in favor, at least from Louisiana constituents. We're also getting calls from all over the country? Kennedy nodded. What about the book? Yes. His publicist looked up from his laptop with a grin. It just jumped to number 3 on Amazon. The publisher is already talking about rushing a second printing. Oh. Despite the favorable indicators, Kennedy knew the next few days would be challenging. There would be calls for apologies, demands for clarification, an endless analysis of his every word and gesture. True to his prediction, that evening every major news network featured segments about the confrontation. Panel discussions debated whether Kennedy had gone too far or whether The View had tried to silence him. Body language experts analyzed his gestures. Fact-checkers examined his statistics. Immigration advocates condemned him while border security proponents praised him, Mrs. Johnson. Bobby's mother appeared on a competing network, telling her son's story to a sympathetic host who asked what it felt like to be used as a political prop by Kennedy. He didn't use me, she said firmly. He listened to me. It's the first person with power who actually seemed to care about what happened to Bobby. 3 days later, The View addressed the incident in their opening segment. Diane spoke directly to the camera, her voice measured and serious. What happened on our show earlier this week was unfortunate. We invited Senator Kennedy to discuss his book and his views. While we expected a spirited debate, we did not anticipate the level of disruption that occurred. She continued, at The View, we pride ourselves on hosting guests with diverse perspectives. However, we also believe in respectful dialogue. When that standard isn't met, we have a responsibility to our viewers to maintain decorum. The show announced new procedures for guest appearances and promised more balanced discussions of controversial topics. They did not invite Kennedy back to respond. A week after his appearance, Kennedy sat in his Senate office in Washington, reviewing polling data with his team. His approval ratings in Louisiana had jumped 8 points. National name recognition had increased significantly. Campaign donations had tripled compared to the previous month. By any political measure, this has been a win for you, Senator, his campaign manager said. The question is, what do you do with this new platform? Kennedy looked thoughtfully at the stack of interview requests on his desk. Every major network wanted him now. Talk shows, Sunday morning programs, cable news, all eager to capitalize on his newfound notoriety. We use it to keep talking about the issues that matter, Kennedy said finally. Not to score political points, but to have the honest conversations this country needs. He picked up a handwritten letter from the stack of mail on his desk. It was from a Border Patrol agent thanking him for highlighting the challenges they face daily. This was never about me, Kennedy said, holding up the letter. It was about all the voices that get silenced because they don't fit a convenient narrative. Those are the stories we need to keep telling. Outside his office window, life in Washington continued as usual. Politicians made speeches. Deals were negotiated. News cycles turned. But something had shifted in the national conversation, if only slightly. A line had been crossed, a taboo broken. Whether it would lead to meaningful change remained to be seen. Kennedy knew that in politics, moments of clarity were rare and often fleeting. He had created such a moment, intentionally or not. What happened next would determine whether it was just another footnote in the endless culture wars, or the beginning of a more honest dialogue about one of America's most divisive issues.